Okay, welcome back. Here we are for our next panel, and I'm just going to hand it right over to Francis. I was just the shusher.
You do a great job, Dan. You're the best shusher in town. He's for hire, shusher for hire. So great to see you all back again. I'm Frances Anderton, co-curator with Mallery. Where's Mallery, who just did the wonderful conversation with Beatrix Oost. Who did not love Beatrix Oost? Fantastic, fantastic. An inspiration, an education. We put the conversation with Beatrix Oost together with the conversation that we're about to have now because there's very definitely a unifying theme. And that unifying theme is getting older. It's real, it happens, we all thought it wouldn't happen and it actually does. More and more of us are single these days. The numbers in terms of rising singles found the family structure's changing, the real estate market is changing. Culturally, we're changing. The boomers and the subsequent generation are looking at the 70s style retirement home and thinking, not for me, don't like it. So there's a lot of really interesting thinking starting to go on in the in design communities, social sciences, the medical area. This has become a buzz topic. How are we going to retire? Or how are we going to not retire? And what kind of environments are we going to live in? I should say the name of the panel, Tales of the City. Who here read and loved Armistead Maupin? How much do we love Armistead Maupin? And I've always carried with him the joy of those stories about a community of really multi-generations that coexisted in San Francisco in those times. So anyway, that was our inspiration, was to what extent are the kinds of environments that we will live in the future be both, how will they evolve physically, and what kinds of communities will we live in? Will we be in nuclear families? Will we be in extended families? Will we be in created families of our own choosing, self-selected in? So we're going to talk about those, or all of this, and we're going to talk about it with 4 architects, actually, each in their own way, reflecting on this, thinking about it, speculating about it. To my left at the end, we have Rick Corsini. He's a partner with Corsini Stark Architecture based in Atwater Village. Among other projects, they've taken on how to build relatively affordable homes. They've looked at the small lot subdivision. But specific to our conversation now, Rick is going to talk about the project or the complex that he himself lives in, which is Gregory Aines' famed Avenel cooperative housing complex. We'll get to that in a moment. To my immediate left is Barbara Bestor, principal with Bestor Architecture. I'm sure many of you have heard that name. Based in Silver Lake, modern architecture firm, self-describes itself as navigating between popular culture, art, and architecture. She's currently working on developing Grey Gardens, who you'll know what that allusion is. Grey Gardens, and I put in the adjective, a modern retirement home, but you're going to tell us all about that. To my immediate left, Elizabeth TIMME. She's co-executive director with LA-Más, which is a non-profit urban design organization. She'll tell us more about that. She just had a speculative project included in a show that's called Shelter that just this last week finished, and in which she speculated on issues to do with extended family, and she'll tell us about that in a moment. And then to my far right, ILARIA MAZZOLENI, architect, founding member and designer of InHabitLA, which is a group working to develop a co-housing community in Los Angeles. So we'll hear from each in a moment, but we're going to start with Rick because he's going to walk us quickly through Avenel, designed by the great Gregory Aines, because I think that project in multiple ways is a very interesting historical example that touches on where we might be able to go in the future. So Rick, over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Frances. I'll start really quickly with the first slide. The story of Avenel is really quite interesting.
Can we have the first slide? Oh, there it is.
It was a group of 10 politically progressive families that grouped their resources, bought a parcel in Silver Lake on a sloping site, and then hired an architect, Gregory Aines, to design 10 houses for themselves. The real story is not quite that simple, but for our purposes, that's effectively what we're talking about. The first slide, which is actually just before this, which is a photograph of the building. And then secondly, then this is the site plan and then a rendering of this. The 10 units, the key things to the design is that they were very efficient. They were intended to be indoor-outdoor spaces. They were intended to be flexible for families of 4. They were built right after World War II as an alternative to the meager, slim pickings of post-war affordable housing. So it was a very kind of a prescient idea. The group was well educated, but they were not wealthy people. They were teachers and people that worked in the community. And this was quite a thing to think of, looking at Richard Neutra or R.M. Schindler and realizing, oh, we can't really afford that, but we're going to find something like that because we value it. The floor plans of these units are very efficient. It's just 1,000 square feet, but what's interesting is they're attached row houses, 1 story, and they have each has a private backyard of about the same size as the interior space. They're also, you'll notice in the plan is staggered, and that's a really key thing because that staggering of the housing units allows for privacy between the units. It also allows the units to be rotated slightly so that they're oriented optimally for daylighting and wind orientation in our Southern California climate.
Rick, I'm going to stop you right now as you walk through the plans. The point is, what you're saying is this was a group that got together, they decided to live as a community, but they wanted to have a fair amount of privacy while
Absolutely.
living as a community. There were some communal spaces, but they went in thinking that they would have their families and move on, and then they wound up staying, some of them, until they died.
That's right.
And this is sort of key, because it was a break in both architecturally, but in terms of the way the American home,
Correct.
or the home building, sort of is predicated on.
Well, we were chatting about this yesterday, in that there's a kind of a financial model about how we handle housing here as a commodity, and there's always this term starter house, right? With the idea that you're going to start off small and gradually work your way up. It's like buying a Volkswagen and ending up with a Mercedes. That this is somehow going to be the model for housing as well. In this case, these were starter houses, and they were ending houses for many people. And part of how that was able to accomplish over the trajectory of a family's growth and evolution is that the design was designed in a way so that it was very, very flexible. It was practical, but it was also mutable. The interiors, if you've seen a few of these slides, there are sliding walls between bedrooms and between 1 bedroom and a living room, which allowed people over time to change the configuration of the houses. When they evolved from a family of 4 with 2 kids, then they became empty nesters, then they became elderly. These interiors changed. And of course, this is some images of my unit, where I now live. It went from bachelor pad to family, to young married couple, to having an 11-year-old daughter in the same space. So that has all of its challenges. But it's also, by contrast, you see one of my neighbors who just recently moved out into a high-rise downtown, but had lived here since 1970. And he and his family had lived here, and it looks very different, of course, from my place. But it has the flexibility of indoor and outdoor space, regardless of its aesthetic, stylistic proclivities. But it also has the ability for, there's one slide here of his workshop that is immediately outside of the unit. And I think that's this. So it's these kinds of, this kind of functional flexibility that's really key to making something like this, that makes it flexible and allows people to grow and change within that configuration over time.
And the point about this was an alternative to a 2,000 square foot single family home where you get to 60, 70, if you've had children, they've left home, you're maybe far from other conveniences, you're far from other people, and suddenly that home becomes not quite so appropriate a place to live. So this was a model. So what can one take away from that?
Well, I think part of it is that there is a very conscious, studious effort to balance community and privacy within the complex, and that people never really felt isolated in this. But you were always able to choose to have the privacy that you needed or not. And I think that configuration means it's not just the relationship of the units themselves and the shared spaces, it's also how it fits into a neighborhood and how convenient it is to have multiple functions, transit, a shop down the street that you can walk to, the park, the local school. All of those are within walking distance of this complex. And over time, it's not necessarily elderly housing, it's not necessarily affordable family housing, it's all of those, and it's all of them at different times over a long period of time.
So Barbara, over to you. I mean, you know your modern architecture. You know how inspiring and progressive Gregory Aim was. He was really interesting in terms of helping this community that wanted to buy in as a group to this community. And obviously, he's wonderful planning and model. But you now are thinking about what kinds of environments people might live in next. What conclusions have you come to? What have you been finding? I know you've been researching the kind of demographics and...
Well, I think that Southern California and Ain in particular offer a lot of examples of these very exciting, essentially utopian communities, and that they sort of go hand in hand with a lot of the aspirations of modernism or of modern architecture. And so it's kind of a challenge, I guess, for architects to try and combat the ubiquity of developer models as the things that are currently driving the housing market. So for us, like we just showed Blackbirds, I think, quickly, but that was a project that was a small lot project done with a very different kind of point of view than the average envelope, and it was largely designed to create a community within it. I think while we were working on that, I got really interested in this idea of aging and aging in place, and the Avenel is certainly one of the best and one of my favorite examples. And particularly one thing about it, aside from the unit size being so small and the outdoor size being so generous, it's also a one-level project, so it's actually an accessible project for the most part. I mean, there's maybe a stair, but so it kind of provides a really nice example of how to achieve density in California without losing a lot of what we architects think are so important about California living, namely like indoor-outdoor living. So we started doing a project called Gray Gardens, which is intentionally a kind of like funny title because I kind of call it senior housing for Gen Xers, because I feel like that's a group that is just, of which I'm a part, which just refuses to think that they're not, 21-year-old skateboarders, and yet we're, 50-ish, and have to think about that. And what's funny about that group is that I suspect, and this goes really for boomer generation too, that no one's too psyched about the Leisure World model, as oh yeah, I'm supposed to go to Arizona? What? Maybe no one likes Husker Du in Arizona. So I think that it was sort of like what would be, how would you create something that could sort of have like a tribal affinity within a housing unit? What would be the right size? But to me, the big thing that was important was actually taking something from contemporary urban design, which is the advent of mixed use, that there's a couple of elements that are brought in that are like, whether it's a restaurant or a bar or a daycare center or something like that, there's a couple other things that are almost like the waves that will come into the tidal pool and kind of replenish the different kinds of people coming in. So our project, which I don't know if it made it up there, but it was essentially a very simple 2-story, I think 22-unit around a big courtyard which had a lot of communal activities, and that at the street level also had sort of mixed use projects. So there's a kind of filter, like the courtyard of the restaurant goes into up against one of the gardens. It's like the outdoor movie screening part of the community center. Really, that was the big thing that would maybe be different than Avenel, was building more of having the community rooms part of it be an important part of the formula, which would be kind of, again, different than the developer formula.
Right, and more we're seeing this. Just yesterday, or just this week, there was published in Atlantic, I guess it was, a dorm rooms for millennials. And dorm rooms for millennials was somebody had bought a big loft, I think it was, and had subdivided it into a common space in the middle and then micro units around the common space. And the idea was that lonely millennials would all be able to affordably rent, because rents are so insane. This was even in Philadelphia, but even there, it's tough to rent. So, and they'd have the little micro units, they'd have their own kitchens, they'd have privacy, and then they'd have the communal space. And the question is that the model that also one might see going forward for older boomers, older Gen Xers, something like that?
I think there's a lot in common, actually. I think that in the sense of isolation that you describe is often, that's typically been associated with with becoming older, and maybe even the dependence on social media is sort of a new reality for older people. But I think that in the city in particular, like when it's so great if you can live somewhere where you can go out your doorway and be at a library or a restaurant or go somewhere like that I think is one of the major draws of bringing a lot of people back to cities in the first place. But the question is affordability. As cities become denser, they become more expensive per square foot. So what becomes the unit size that's not just tolerable but kind of nice size to be in? And is it a 350 square foot micro apartment, or is it a 1,000 square foot, flexible multi-bedroom like that? That's kind of going to be maybe one of the questions to explore architecturally.
Elizabeth, you go out and talk to people in the community, don't you? That's part of the way you conduct your practice. And you explored a specific community and engaged with the question of keeping the family or the extended family in place. Did I understand that correctly? And is that something, are we going to be, we've sort of, there's a marvelous book that's just been published called The Making of Home, and it looks at 500 years of moving from the house to the home and what that has meant. But it's been 500 years of getting more and more private, basically. The home used to be a room where 10 people lived and did everything together. And now we have 7,000 square foot houses with 3 people rattling around and 7 bathrooms. But have we come to the end of the road of that search for total privacy? And are we now going back to trying to find some way to live more perhaps like we might have lived traditionally with other generations? Real estate prices might drive that, or is it desire?
Well, we started looking at this issue of diversity because our offices are located in Frogtown, otherwise known as Elysian Valley, which is right in the heart of the river revitalization right now. And so we were hired to do a 10-month-long co-visioning process with the community there and find out what they wanted and what their biggest goal was, and it was diversity. They wanted to maintain diversity. And so we talked to them about affordable housing, and that doesn't actually maintain the actual diversity, it only maintains census diversity. And so the community said, well, how could you reinvent the typology of housing in our neighborhood? And it gets very much at what everyone else has talked about, the communal and reinventing the communal or reestablishing the site of housing as being the backyard. And it was also a response to the developer-driven conversation that's been had about density. And that looks very atypical in Los Angeles when 80% of our residential land use is single-family homes. So this idea that, the skyscraper effect is going to be the best solution for 80% of Los Angeles is a misnomer. So we started looking at what if the granny flat wasn't just a standalone building, but a total spine in the backyard? And how could we start to leverage financially that diversity to support older homes? As they get older, they can rent out that back unit or move into that back unit and get supportive services from family members or renters so that they wouldn't have to leave their community.
And currently the city is working on trying to sort of legitimize the granny flat.
I'm on the Recode LA team, so I'm helping to rewrite the zoning codes surrounding that. Or that's a little verbose. I'm giving limited advice. And the mansionization and the accessory dwelling unit, aka granny flat, is a really big deal.
And it's a big deal because it's a way to achieve more housing in situ without building a massive tower block or whatever. But what does it mean for aging in place?
I think a lot of people are having conversations throughout Los Angeles about gentrification and the change of our neighborhoods. And this is a way to maintain that diversity, that history of a person who knows what the neighborhood was like 50 years ago. And they can stay put, and most people want to. And then they can either rent out a unit in the back or they can move to that unit. So it's really about, as someone ages, not having to go move somewhere else, but staying put and being a part of the history of the community.
Because that's been the thing that's sort of defined, I guess, society since the war, is this notion that you hit 70 and you move. You sort of move miles away and go and live in some completely different community. And is that something that is desirable for us, or is it actually disruptive, highly, just tears our kind of sense of connection to all our friends and community apart? So ILARIA is involved in a very interesting experiment that I do believe that there's an increasing number of people who are interested in trying to do this, which is come together with friends or family members, whatever, relatives, whatever mix of people, and create one's own community. It's partly to do with the horrendous cost of property in places we want to live, like LA, and it's partly to do with the idea, maybe it's a boomer thing, maybe it's a Gen X thing, that we want to create our own environments. We don't want to be siloed in some retirement home. So anyway, this is a model that you can find widely in say, Germany, the co-housing model. It's a hard one to pull off in LA, in the way real estate's structured. Anyway, ILARIA and a group is trying to do it. So just tell us about your experience of trying to do it, and why you're doing it, and the experience of doing it.
Yes, I think we are trying to do it because of all the reasons that have been elencated here. And primarily is actually, we are not really quite ready to retire or even to admit that we will never retire. But we still pretend that we are in our youth, but we rather not want to live in isolation, but create a community that both within it and connecting to the outer, larger community of whichever neighborhood, we can create an exchange. And this exchange is both of interests. So it wants to be diverse really as LA is diverse, but it adds, I think, also on generations. So in LA, I think we find most of us stratified of hanging out with people more or less of our age. And this idea of extended families is not so communal. So some of the initial members, some of us wanted to have a community where both kids and grandparents would be present. So intergenerational within the same structure. So that is one of the main components, I think, or elements. The other is recognizing that we cannot afford a single family house, even though it's still the American dream, no matter what people say. But we don't also buy into the very large developments we see around LA right now. And we do like the intermediate model that we do see, for example, in West Hollywood, there are a lot of developments that are not necessarily co-housing, but the size. And the additional element that has been attractive to us is to be near the developing metro system that LA is finally developing, but it's very important, and it will shape the city, and is already shaping the market, unfortunately, because since we started looking for a lot, and that's where we are having now our initial very big struggles, is to find an affordable site. Affordable not by the definition of the code of affordable housing, because we are not part of that social group, but affordable to professionals that have certain budgets. And that's where really our effort right now of this diverse group of people that is still open and meets once a month, every 2 weeks, has discussions about the different governance, marketing issues, anything, right? Because the other element is that really building a community is building a way of living together. It's not just meeting once every so often, but you have to deal with the fact that you have your own unit, but you're sharing a lot of communal spaces, and you have to be okay with that, and not just okay in paper, but you have to coexist with these people until you're older, hopefully. And even though on paper we are all fine, but you know how many text messages it takes you to decide which restaurant to go to with your friends, right? You can imagine living together with 15 people that have an opinion about it.
So there's 15 of you.
15 to 20 the units. We are not yet 15 that has become a member, but we are like, there are like 40 people interested at the moment, but becoming member, you have to do a down payment, and the location, of course, in a city like Los Angeles matters to many people.
But the idea is to pull this off and then stay there.
Yes.
This is about staying
Yes.
into old age.
Yes, yes. And to have already some people that are joining us that are older, so that they can help them as grandparents with the grandchild and be helped eventually. So you create also this kind of exchange as a community works. I grew up in a village, so I very understand.
So you're creating a village within a megalopolis.
Yes, that's a little bit too romantic, but yes.
Rick, I think you wanted to add something. Yeah.
Yes. Well, you know, I think this idea of community is really the key thing. To me, it's really also about how we design our neighborhoods, and that means that the design of the infrastructure, and in particularly transit, is a key component of making this work. And at this point, I don't know if you've read recently that it's now going to be, I know this because my mom is 93 years old and she still drives her car.
Wow.
She's going to be, elderly people will be tested every year, starting next year, I think. It means that there's going to be fewer and fewer elderly people who are able to drive a car. That is a transformative bit of regulation. Suddenly, to me, it kind of spells the end of the auto-oriented dominance of, post-war urban design, and it starts to put it back into a more urban, traditional city configuration. And we start thinking about how people live, multi-generational families, individuals, all permutations of those relationships, and elderly people. They live cheek by jowl together in Manhattan, in San Francisco, in a hill town in Italy, wherever it might be, outside of Tokyo. This is a common pattern, and I think it's something in LA we have to face up to the fact that transportation is the key thing that makes this all really work. And for the transit to work, you're going to need a certain level of density for that to work. Because a single family neighborhood with high capacity transit or a trolley system is not dense enough to support it economically. So that to me is the structure that you have to back into to understand how are we going to build a better neighborhood, a more vital one that serves all these various functions that we need.
And I think the good news is that LA continuously is growing, right? It's a city that actually has more and more population, so there is a need to both create those infrastructure, and in fact we are having them. So it is transforming. So it's happening. It's just how to allow these different formats to be part, of the equation.
Really, it's a chicken and egg relationship between our regulatory environment and what the marketplace is demanding. In a certain way, you were talking earlier about. What is the family unit with the extended family? Well, the extended family that we think about is a rarity in certain demographics, but actually all around us, that extended family has never left, right? It's all around the city in the various ethnic groups and neighborhoods, and it's not in the higher economic world as much, although it's becoming more so. So I think those patterns are actually they're all around us. The people are here. The problem is our regulations have been getting in the way of all that kind of growing in a more productive and better designed way.
Okay, we're going to throw it open to questions in a moment, but I'm going to ask each of you the same question. What would be your dream environment to be old in?
One that nobody thinks that is old.
Right. That's the key. That's the key. Yeah. And near a hospital. I'm sorry. Near a hospital. Elizabeth.
I think, yeah, this is the same, and some place where I would have access to being able to interact with other cultures and travel, and telemedicine, and the kind of Marshall McLuhan global village would be at my front door.
Telemedicine being, for anyone that hasn't heard of telemedicine?
Telemedicine is the idea that through Skype or your computer, you can interact with a practitioner at a moment's notice. And it also is kind of a collaborative community of people sharing their symptoms and issues with each other.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
As you get older, you really want to avoid talking about. If you manage to pass a day without talking about your health, I think is a good day, right?
Right. No, absolutely. No, it's just one can have some bad experiences sometimes sharing advice on the internet. You can sometimes get the wrong advice. But Barbara, what's your dream environment?
I look for them like almost every week. I'm like, what about, okay, here would be good. But I like Silver Lake, Los Feliz, Larchmont Village. I kind of like, I'm a neighborhoody, go get a cup of coffee, talk to people person. And so that like these sort of urban environments that are manageable. And I feel like LA is full of them. I feel like there's like 40 or 50 of them, sort of these micro-urban villages that exist. And so it's actually, I don't feel like that's a problem finding that. It's kind of more the like design of the home and the accessibility issues and daylight and kind of the privacy issues that you talked about in Avenel. Like, how do you get a kind of high quality of life and not be sort of stuck in a generic, condo building that's
But
got smelly hallways?
Would you envision yourself being with having your children, grandchildren around, or with your friends? What's the social environment?
I think, well, who knows with children? As far as I have teenage children, I'm like, I don't know where they're going to go, but I would assume that they would like it enough that they'd come back to the neighborhood, and my mom lives in my neighborhood. It's my children, it's a kind of, I feel like I know a bunch of different people from kid age to older age, and that's what I really like, is that sort of village-like existence, which again, I think is actually, I think it's harder maybe up in the hills of LA, like when you have like a beautiful house up in the hills, it does seem a little more isolating. People take walks and stuff, but that whole long drive to the supermarket, so I would never do that. I would go like down to the flats where the rest of us are.
And you wouldn't move to it. Would anybody on this panel move to a desert retirement community? No. No. Rick, what's your ideal? You're in the ideal right now.
I'm kind of in the ideal right now.
You're in the ideal.
But I think if I'm thinking of it as a fantasy, it'd be, I'd be in, Paris in the left bank, or I would be in Manhattan in Greenwich Village or something, and that would be ideal as a place to be.
So urban environment, you can walk, museums,
absolutely.
Good coffee.
Then my family, if they want to, they can come to visit us and they can stay in a hotel or something. But, that might be perfect, right? But
did you ever know Brian Murphy, who was the designer in LA, Brian Murphy? He chose to give up living in a home that he owned and live in a hotel. Mm-hmm. That seems like a good possibility.
Yeah,
it's just living in a hotel.
It's, it's funny because, as we were talking about all these models, the idea came to me of, there used to be things called boarding houses, right, as an urban housing format that went out, with the whole post-war auto-oriented thing, and that had a bad name because it was like single men of a certain age and whatever was going on within them. But they served a huge purpose for small groups or an individual that could actually live in a communal environment and be in the city and have a job and meet some people if they needed to or not. And that was there's a whole typology that's missing within that, which would relate to that.
They're actually completely legal in LA. Did you know that? You could still have a boarding house. Yeah, so if you had a 40-room mansion, you could turn it into senior housing for your friends. It's good to know.
May I add one element?
ILARIA.
I think one element also that we seek more and more, or back to it, is to have open spaces. I think the model of the first house to have outdoor spaces, and as you can move less, having outdoor spaces in a place like LA is really a desirable factor. Reconnecting to nature, if you want to use a very bucolic term, but in a very simplistic way, without having to go to the desert, just sitting on the sun as a lizard. I think it would, it's a nice way to spend the afternoon. And so more outdoor spaces and these large developments are lacking of that very much.
I became very conscious of all of this when my father passed and my mother was widowed, and then my husband's mother divorced, I guess. So here was two women, both getting older and both on their own. My mother wound up living in a kind of courtyard type situation. The courtyard has served her so well. She's made all these friends because she's in this courtyard. And my mother-in-law was living in this dreadful gated community where everything was a cul-de-sac, and all the condos were designed to give no visual connection to any other property. So therefore she has total privacy, and it's completely car dependent, and she became immobile. So she was trapped. She was trapped in this house where she could see nobody and nobody could see her. And I thought it was a form of imprisonment. Some people might think it's great. I'm a hermit. I'd rather not see anybody. That's great. But generally, it seemed like those kind of developments emerged in the optimistic, car-driven era that we're now seeing the limitations of, and we're now rethinking. We're going to throw it open to questions, but Elizabeth, you did bring up the telemedicine. Technology is a big piece of aging in the future. Do you want to just sort of expand on that? I mean, there's so much going on in that whole field that's going to change things.
Yeah, sure. We did some research on cerebral palsy treatment in hospitals, and kids were hacking the Kinect, which is the kind of infrared device that comes with a Wii or an Xbox. And it was kind of exciting because you could scan your body, and then you could move and then send that file to a doctor. And so the idea being that we would get rid of these megaplexes where it's kind of an urban model to have an urban hospital that's like MIT. It just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. To go to a village model where it's a small nodal hospital or clinic, and you're going there and everyone knows you, and you walk in the door and you're out 45 minutes later. And if it's something more serious, you go to that urban hospital potentially. But the idea that there's a real interface in your home between your health and updates on your health and with your kind of local clinic, which if you start to look at all of our strip malls, they're already there. It's just, most of the upper middle class doesn't use them. So I think Los Angeles is really poised to have like a clinic model that serves us in a way that's far more humane than the kind of urban USC Medical Center model, which is quite overwhelming, upsetting, and disorienting when you're in a time of crisis.
Let's open it to some questions. One over here.
I am so grateful that you guys did this panel because I do end-of-life work for over 20 years of helping people who are dying and their families, and telemedicine, which is on the computer. And this is what I've been dealing with for 20 years, of where do people live, where do they go? We're in West Hollywood, but everyone is, one medical condition away from homelessness, basically, in this country, with everything you're talking about. So I'm just so grateful that you did it. And Uber is actually training drivers to take care of the elderly. There's an Institute of Aging, Institute of Medicine. We're all trying to do so many things to help. And I just love you guys are doing housing and thinking about it, because I've been trying for 20 years. And I'm so glad to learn about it. I can have people in their art places and in our culture and independence that we value and giving it up, and what you're talking about one, your mother-in-law's this and your mother is this, and where do we go, and you're young and you're doing all these great things, and these communities, I'm just so grateful for everyone. So there are people working on things and thinking about things, and just beautiful to hear it.
What, based on your experience, do you find is the kind of environment that people would most like to be in or die in?
Well, it's so funny because 20 years ago I said there's no way baby boomers are going to go to nursing homes. I was like, there's just no way. I had the World War II people dying and the Holocaust people dying, those people dying, and we're like, what's the cheapest? I'll go in this home, just put me in this home. And they wanted to die because they didn't lose their home. They're like, if I die now, will my wife lose my home? I mean, those were the kinds of questions I was getting 20 years ago, which younger, I was like, what do you mean if you die now? Because you can lose your home.
you. Thank you.
I think I can be kind of a case in point. My mother at 67, I built her a house in Costa Rica. And that resolved so many of the issues that I think that she foresaw in her aging, and that she lives, you know, in a tropical paradise.
That's the answer.
But she's also incredibly isolated, and after 5 years living with her and her realizing she had severe osteoporosis and could no longer walk down 300-meter gravel road without literally risking, you know, her life, the problems that came up were not the problems you thought they'd be. It was just getting groceries. It was, you know, having people around you to help you with the most basic of tasks, because she's on the one hand really happy being isolated as a retired artist, and maybe that's not an issue in a metropolitan city. But for example, another thing that we learned to solve together was that I was recently married and she was unable to travel to our wedding here in LA, so we put her on an iPad and FaceTimed her for 6 straight hours. And everyone was able to interact with her and vice versa, and it was an incredible, magical, technological moment. Right? However, my question is, are there any problems that you can imagine that are not in fact solvable by technology, you know, or that are much harder to solve that way?
Well, you brought up the groceries. I suppose she can order the groceries.
Instacart, which is why it's hard to come up with those, but I think that they're there. I was thinking of perhaps mental illness.
Mental illness, or she has a fall in the night. Where does she go? Who does she call on to take her to? I mean, I guess those would be the questions when one's, because I guess we've been talking. I guess there's 2 levels of living old. There's living older but reasonably healthy, and then there's immobile towards the end of life. Those are very different. And a lot of us in this room are starting to deal with our parents in the context of really getting towards the end of life. We ourselves are trying to reimagine ourselves as the endless skateboarder. Did you see that? Was it on the cover of AARP? There was this 70-year-old skateboarder. It was. Yeah.
Missed that.
Yeah, we've all got this happy vision of ourselves as skateboarding into the end. So, yeah, into the sunshine. Thank you. Into the tropical paradise. But do any of you want to respond to his question about sort of what's the, you're the one that's really looking into the technology.
I think it's hard to predict. I think there's a number of ways in which technology is incredible for people who are increasingly shut in by their body, and it gives them a format and a venue to communicate and to stay active mentally. However, physically speaking, there's a certain mobility that technology can't afford. And I think that having the kind of architectural and urban planning investments to create small proximities that incentivize mobility for the elderly is really important. And you can't get that done on, you know, a treadmill when someone isn't going to be motivated and get the stimulus to do that. So I would say that.
Well, I was just going to say that maybe it's not so much technology, but the creating of community in, say, new developments is not an easy thing. And I guess I was just going to say to any of you guys who are on review boards, or if you're not, you should maybe go on them, join them, because really what you need as architects, like we're working in a context where things really are driven by a maximum dollar per square foot formula, and that generally to community anything, you know, like it's sort of how many units can we pack in here, but literally, like if you took your average even 200 unit building but had a couple of different public squares within it and a couple of different places, it would radically transform the quality of life possible in those. And I don't think, usually review boards are more like it should have, you know, mixed gables on the roof or something. They're not really about that kind of issue, but that's really the issue that we'll all feel as we get older.
Well, you know, it's funny though, because I think you'd be surprised because it's so seldom actually proposed in these. I mean, We had a couple of these design review board things just this week, which I'm exhausted by. But you know, as soon as you present something as simple as an alley that's used as shared space between units, and that there's a transition space for a patio, and it's something that people can interact with, which also means that if you have an elderly person in one unit and you have a family in another, they actually know that they exist, and they can actually maybe have coffee once in a while together. Just really dumb, simple stuff that's really profound. And the fact that there's a garden in the right place for a unit, it's amazing how quickly people come together around really simple things like that, and it does become a consensus building device, if you want to think of it politically that way. So I think that, you know, because the problem I think that we have so much in terms of our institutions, meaning our housing, our hospitals, our schools, et cetera, the problems we have is our business models get in the way of them being responsive to our actual needs. And I think the more we can start redefining and demanding how those institutions shape our lives, the better off we're going to be.
And I would say weirdly, they're just also, they become worth so much more. Actually, property values go up a lot if it's a desirable, you know, people start getting in line to go live in that place. It's a different ballgame. Sorry for Laria.
No. I think the notion of privacy is switching with technology. You know, we have been this private and public, right, is the first diagram you make when you design something, and the idea of being totally private and et cetera. And now with technology, there is no privacy anymore, right? You text to someone and someone posted, and so I think this notion of what is private and public, even in the community review boards, it will change, because as we get older, we need that connection. I think any elder that is relegated in his or her castle feels still alone, right? And the motivation for leaving is the motivation of being connected to you as your mother. So she or he can be in the best place in the world, but if he or she feels isolated, it's demotivating, especially in very advanced elderly condition, right? So I think this notion of changing or helping to change this notion of privacy for our culture is one of the critical aspects.
And I think there's also, we have to be aware of the kind of the formulas that everybody tends to respond to for whatever category it might be, because like if you're thinking about housing for the elderly, you think, oh, it's all got to be one story, it's got to be, got to roll in through the whole thing and all that. I think of my mom, who still lives in the house that we grew up in, which is a 2-story house. She walks up and down the stairs 6 times a day, and I can't think that, and then she cooks dinner for us once a week, so she gets FaceTime with us. Somehow those things are, I think, are part of why, explain part of her longevity. And I think if I had been hired as an architect to design an elderly housing complex, I wouldn't have any of those things in those housing units, because the formula is saying, oh no, you can't have stairs, the elderly can't have stairs within their units. Oh no, you're going to have a kitchen, they're going to burn themselves, or it's going to be a communal thing, dinners are going to be cooked separately. You know, there's all these rules that start to get in the way of some real common sense.
Question here.
It's interesting hearing all these ideas. I think that the LA landscape is, I think what's very interesting about LA in particular is that it's been shaped, it has a history of being shaped, I think, by people who aren't from Los Angeles. You know, so many architects that are seen as LA architects are from just about anywhere else. And I'm wondering where each of you are from originally. But also, I'm wondering, as some of the issues of, you know, if you're committing to design or concerns for retirement, I think we're in a time that's very particular in LA, where the landscape is changing very rapidly, and it's hard to commit to a place knowing that it could be very different. And I think as an LA native, there are things about Los Angeles I'm still kind of in love with that don't exist anymore. I grew up in Beachwood Canyon, but I live in Venice now, and Venice is changing so tremendously, so quickly, in areas that I think a few years ago I would have thought, this is the place that I want to be. I don't know if it's going to be a place I want to be in 10 years or in 20 years. So how do you address that in terms of design as well? Not just their flexibility of the unit, like the Avenel.
That's exactly what.
How do you address what happens around you?
That's what Elizabeth was grappling with in the Frogtown area, which is also seeing rapid change, and how does a community sort of stay in place that wants to stay in place?
And I think, you know, I'm actually from Houston, Texas, but I moved here in 1994 and grew up in Beechwood Canyon as well. And I've seen, you know, downtown, Beechwood, Los Feliz, a lot of neighborhoods really transition into the arts communities or the artists not being able to be there anymore or move into those spaces. And when I moved here from Houston, Texas, I was shocked at how present and vibrant the Latino community was. And that Latino urbanism in Los Angeles was a real thing in Santee Alley and Broadway, and it was a way to kind of adapt spaces that were derelict and make them vibrant. And that wasn't how Houston operated. And so it has been really sad seeing places like Broadway or Grand Central Market turn that volume down in a way that's not intentional. And so the project that we did in Frogtown was an attempt to create a new urban space in the backyard to promote diversity, exactly like what you're talking about.
Or to maintain diversity.
Yes.
To maintain diversity, to sort of try and hold off too rapid change and gentrification. Yeah, because Venice is so crazy right now, and if one's renting in LA, if one doesn't own one's own property, there's that fear of just how long am I going to have this, or is the landlord going to kick me out? And so therefore, there's a financial worry that goes with a worry just about all the other things that we're talking about. The last standout, last holdout.
But maybe it's also in certain areas inevitable, right? It's very difficult to push back what is happening in Venice because the magnitude. But perhaps that's the possibility of starting to promote new models so that other neighborhoods is such a large territory, right? That we can consider other areas and not continuing making the same mistakes in a way, right? So changing the zoning, or a lot needs to be happening also at that level, I think, because it's not just about, you know, if you cannot really build in LA, we are looking for land now, and either is single family home or is commercial zone in the main boulevard. And nobody really wants to live also in the main boulevard necessarily, right? But it's very difficult to find something in between because of the zoning very often. So.
Time. So we're done. I've just got the word from Darren. We are done. But I hope we didn't end on a downer. I think to the extent there's a conclusion from all of this, it's that this is a conversation that's happening quite broadly. I mean, we're all hearing it anecdotally, and it's get engaged with the local community because it's going to have an impact on one's individual future. Is that fair to say? Thank you, Ilaria, Elizabeth, Barbara, Rick.